The US Vice-President and Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris has added her voice to international condemnation of the loss of civilian life in Saturday's deadly Israeli airstrike on a school compound in Gaza. Around 1,000 displaced Palestinians had been sheltering in the building at the time of the dawn strike. The Israeli military insists that it used precision missiles to target what it claims was a Hamas command center in the compound. Now, the director of a local hospital said that the facility had received 70 bodies and the remains of at least 10 more people. Israel disputes those figures. Well, this is what Ms. Harris said on the campaign trail. Take a listen.
You know, yet again, there are far too many civilians who have been killed. I mean, Israel has a right to go after the terrorists that are Hamas. But as I have said many, many times, they also have, I believe, an important responsibility to avoid civilian casualties.
Well, the Biden administration has also responded to news of the attack. A White House National Security Council spokesperson says, quote, "We are deeply concerned about reports of civilian casualties. We're in touch with our Israeli counterparts and we are asking for further details. We know Hamas has been using schools as locations to gather and operate out of, but we have also said repeatedly and consistently that Israel must take measures to minimize civilian harm." Just hours before the bombing, the US State Department announced that it's releasing $3.5 billion worth of weapons for Israel, part of a larger aid package approved earlier this year by Congress. Now, this report from Jenny Hill contains images that you may find distressing.
Anguish, bewilderment. Israel struck before dawn, shattering the sanctity of morning prayer. Thousands of displaced civilians were sheltering here, a place of refuge, suddenly a scene of carnage. There isn't any safe place, this woman cries. No place is safe. Where is the world, he asks. Why does it stay silent in the face of these crimes? How many times have Gaza's ravaged walls echoed to the sound of a mother's grief? Says 3 of her sons were killed. I'm 80, she sobs. I've never seen anything like this before. The way they're bombing us is like an earthquake. But Israel claims this was a legitimate target, that the school housed a Hamas command center. In a statement on social media, an Israeli Defense Force spokesman said around 20 Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants were operating out of the compound. Israel's repeatedly struck school buildings in recent weeks. Each time they insist they conceal Hamas bases, and each time they insist they strive to minimize civilian casualties.
The strike comes at a time of heightened tension in the Middle East. International governments are urging Hamas and Israel to agree a ceasefire and hostage return deal as soon as possible. And extensive diplomacy is ongoing to try to stop the conflict in Gaza from spiralling into an all-out regional war.
And as Palestinians mourn their dead and take shelter for another fearful night, it's hard to see hope in the ruins of Gaza. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Tel Aviv.
Well, I've been speaking to Mohammed Taha from BBC Arabic, who explained the amount of pressure Israel was coming under.
Lots of condemnation, international condemnation to the amount of civilian deaths in this strike. Algeria, the Arab country, is requesting an urgent meeting for the UN Council to discuss the matter, and lots of calls to Israel to constrain. Israel, however, continued shelling some parts of Rafah, Khan Yunis, and asked lots of parts in eastern Khan Yunis to evacuate. We're expecting more strike in the coming hours. This is what's happening normally when they ask people to evacuate. Hamas denied completely that there were fighters of them in the compound or in the prayer area. Israel issued a statement, named 20 people or so who are Israel saying they are belong to Hamas and they were in the compound. Hamas said these fighters were killed previously in previous occasion, and there are clear instructions for their fighters not to mix with the civilians, and even if there were fighters in this area, they wouldn't be praying with the people in the school.
You mentioned that international condemnation from the likes of Algeria, also the White House, and Vice-President Kamala Harris saying too many civilians are being killed in this conflict, the possibility of a UN Security Council meeting. Is that likely to exert any pressure?
Of course, because now there is a mounting pressure on Israel to return back to the negotiating table on Thursday, as suggested by the United States. If the UN Council would come and have a statement that's calling both parties to return back to the negotiating table, that would be a positive, and it could also place pressure on Israel to avoid such targeting to shelter places, because it became a systematic practice from the Israeli army that they would target schools, hospitals, and places that they are taking shelter. And even though places that the Israeli army would suggest that they are safe places, but they return back and strike these places.
And also reports today amid concerns of a broader regional war, an exchange of fire between Hezbollah and Israel. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, this is another front that is open now in this war. We saw that Hezbollah struck new places, Mahfat alone and Safad in northern Israel, and wide areas in Al Jalil in northern Israel. Also, Israel replied by shelling some parts in southern Lebanon, like Al Hula and Majd al Salm. There are fears, as always, that Hezbollah would retaliate for the killing of Fuad Shukr, their leader, and also the expected reply from Iran for the killing of Ismail Hani.
Well, let's go straight to our correspondent, Jenny Hill, who is in Tel Aviv. Good to see you there, Jenny. Just bring us up to date with the latest.
Well, the US, arguably Israel's greatest ally and, of course, a major supplier of weapons, has expressed its dismay at the strike as that international condemnation mounts. We heard from Vice-President Kamala Harris, who said that yet again, too many civilians have been killed. She added that Israel has the right to go after Hamas, but it also bears a special responsibility to avoid civilian casualties. The Israeli military continues to insist that it used precision missiles to target what it claims was a Hamas command center within the school compound. It's published a list of the names of 19 people killed in the strike, which it says were either Hamas or Islamic Jihad operatives. The big question, of course, as you've been asking all morning, I imagine, is where does this leave any hope of a ceasefire and hostage return deal? Because, of course, the strike came at a time of very heightened tension in the Middle East, with the international community urging both Hamas and Israel to get to the negotiating table and agree upon a ceasefire and hostage return deal. Kamala Harris herself reiterated those demands, but listen to what Hamas had to say in reaction to the strike. They described it as a horrific crime and said that Israel in effect had escalated the conflict. So this morning in Gaza, as people continue to mourn their dead, absorb the shock and of course pray for those injured, the prospect of peace seems very remote indeed.
And Jenny, how are those comments from the likes of Harris, the White House? We know that Algeria, for example, also calling for a UN Security Council meeting. How are they being received there in Israel? I imagine it depends on who you speak to.
Well, of course. I mean, Israel says it's going after Hamas as a matter of self-defense. The Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has said, his aim is to completely dismantle the organization. A lot of the Israeli press are publishing what the Israeli military are saying, that this was in effect a legitimate target. We've seen a string of similar attacks on schools in Gaza by the Israeli military in recent weeks, and Each time we see a very familiar pattern. The Israeli military will say, well, there was a Hamas command center or base within that school. Schools, of course, are no longer being used as schools. They're largely being used as shelters by the many, many displaced people of Gaza. But the Israeli military say each time they go out of their way to avoid civilian casualties with, for example, the use of precision missiles and the use of intelligence that they've gathered. So we are once again in a familiar routine. I think what perhaps makes this particular strike stand out is the number of dead, of course. That is why we are seeing such international outrage and calls for an urgent return to the negotiating table.
Our correspondent Jenny Hill in Tel Aviv. Jenny, thank you very much.